In part one of this study, we looked at the biblical texts relevant to God's covenantal promise of the ancient land of Canaan to the descendants of Abraham as their homeland. We noted that this promise was conditioned upon the enduring faithfulness of the Israelite people to their God, as specifically stated in the Mosaic covenant. And we concluded with Jesus' prophecy that because the Israelite nation had by and large rejected him as their promised Messiah, their land would be forfeit. Your house is being left to you desolate. In part two, we're going to conduct a brief historical survey of the occupation and control of the former Israelite territory from the late 1st century up to the present time. In 63 BC, Roman armies under the command of Julius Caesar's arch-rival Pompey absorbed the Israelite homeland into the Roman Empire. And for the next 75 years, the Jews were granted the privilege of partial self-rule under a series of vassal kings, the most famous of whom was Herod the Great. Now, when Herod died in 4 BC, his realm was divided into 4 tetrarchies, ruled by 3 of his sons and 1 by his sister. In the year AD 6, some 10 years after the death of Herod the Great, the Romans deposed his son Archelaus from his tetrarchy over the regions of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, and combined those 3 into a single province called Judea, with its capital at Caesarea. In the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the province of Judea became the site of 2 large-scale Jewish revolts against Rome. During the First Jewish-Roman War, which lasted from AD 66 to 73, the Romans razed the city of Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. And the last stand in this war occurred in AD 73 in the desert fortress of Masada, where Jewish zealots preferred to commit suicide rather than to endure Roman captivity. In AD 132, another Jewish rebellion broke out. The Bar Kokhba rebellion, as it was called, took 3 years to put down, and it inflicted massive losses on both the Jews and the Romans, and left much of Judea in ruins. And as a result, the center of Jewish life moved from Judea to Galilee, centering on the city of Tiberias. During or after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, the Emperor Hadrian joined the province of Judea with Galilee and Phoenicia to form a new province called Syria Palestina, and Jerusalem was renamed Aelia Capitolina. Now, some scholars view these actions as an attempt to disconnect the Jewish people from their homeland, but this theory is debated. The name Palestine, or in Latin Palestina, is thought to have been a term coined by the ancient Greeks for the area of land occupied by the Philistines, although there are other explanations for the origin of the name. But what we need to understand here is that the name Palestine, like the name America, was a geographic name, not a national or ethnic name. Following the victory of Emperor Constantine, in the civil wars of the early 4th century, the Christianization of the Roman Empire began. Palestine became a major center of Christianity, attracting numerous monks and religious scholars. In 614, Palestine was briefly annexed by a Persian dynasty, the Sassanids, but it returned to Byzantine control in 628. The province of Palestina was later subdivided into smaller administrative units. Palestina Prima, or Palestine I, encompassed the central parts of the region, including the coastal plain, Judea and Samaria, with its capital at Caesarea. Palestina Secunda, or Palestine II, roughly comprised Galilee, the Jezreel Valley, and the southern part of the Golan Plateau, with its capital in Scythopolis, better known as Bethshan. Palestina Tertia, or Palestine III, covered the area of the Negev Desert and most of the Sinai Peninsula and the southwestern portion of Transjordan, south of the Dead Sea. These provinces existed from AD 390 until their conquest by Muslim armies in the 7th century. Palestine was conquered by the Islamic Rashidun Caliphate beginning in 634. This marked the beginning of 1,300 years of almost uninterrupted Islamic control, although it shifted several times between rival Islamic caliphates. The Dome of the Rock, completed in 691 on the site of the Jewish temple, was the world's first great work of Islamic architecture. And if you go to Jerusalem today, you can see that it's still there. Palestine reverted to Christian control in 1099 during the First Crusade. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, at its height, stretched all the way from Syrian Antioch to Gaza. The Crusader presence in the Middle East lasted from 1099 to 1291. However, their control of Jerusalem and most of Palestine had lasted just less than a century when they were defeated in 1187 by the forces of Sultan Saladin, the founder of the Islamic Ayyubid dynasty. The region returned to Christian control briefly in 1229, when it was retaken by the Second Kingdom of Jerusalem. But after holding it for only 15 years, Jerusalem and Palestine were retaken by Islamic Turks in 1244. And despite 7 further crusades, the Christians were simply no longer a significant power in the region. And in 1291, their last stronghold fell to the Islamic Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. Almost 200 years later, in 1486, hostilities broke out between rival Islamic powers for control over Western Asia. They were the Arabic Mamluks in Egypt and the Turkish Ottomans in Asia Minor. The Ottomans eventually prevailed, and they conquered Palestine in 1516 and held it until the end of World War I. In 1917, as World War I was nearing its end, the British cabinet published what came to be known as the Balfour Declaration, which stated Great Britain's support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. In 1922, following World War I and the resulting breakup of the Ottoman Empire, the League of Nations formally conferred upon Great Britain the mandate to govern the region of Palestine. The British Mandate for Palestine, as it was formally called, included all the territory of modern Israel and Jordan, plus the Golan Heights. Thus, Britain was in a position to implement the goals of the Balfour Declaration. Later that year, however, the Mandate for Palestine was divided into 2 administrative territories. Mandatory Palestine, which was open to Jewish settlement, and the Emirate of Transjordan, which was not. And thus a total of 77% of Palestine was closed to Jewish settlement. And today over 70% of the residents of Jordan are Palestinian Arabs. Somewhat later, the British transferred control of the Golan Heights to the French Mandate of Syria. Britain quickly found the administration of the mandate to be expensive and troublesome. The non-Jewish residents of Mandatory Palestine revolted in 1920, and again in 1929, and yet again in 1936. In 1947, amidst the redrawing of the world map after World War II, the British government announced its desire to terminate the mandate. And accordingly, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution for the partition of Mandatory Palestine into an Arab state, a Jewish state, and a special international regime to oversee the city of Jerusalem. Jewish leadership accepted the proposal, but the Arab Higher Committee rejected it. Nevertheless, the State of Israel was declared on May 14, 1948. And the very next day, the armies of 4 Arab countries, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq, invaded parts of what had been Mandatory Palestine, launching the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. After a year of fighting, a ceasefire was declared, and temporary borders known as the Green Line were established. Jordan annexed what became known as the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip. The rest of the old Mandatory Palestine was incorporated into the State of Israel. There was no corresponding Palestinian state. The UN estimated that more than 700,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled from their homes in the face of advancing Israeli forces during the conflict. Some 156,000 others remained and became Arab citizens of Israel. In 1967, the same 4 Arabic nations, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, mobilized for a renewed attack on Israel with the goal of ending her existence as a nation. But Israeli intelligence had discovered the plan. And on June 5th, Israeli military forces launched a preemptive strike against the Arab coalition on all sides. And in 6 days, from June 5th through the 10th, Israel completely routed the Arab forces and occupied the Jordanian territory of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the Syrian territory of the Golan Heights, and the Egyptian territory of the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula. The civilian displacements as a result of the 6-day war would have serious long-term consequences. Some 300,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from the West Bank. About 100,000 Syrians were displaced from the Golan Heights, and about 1 million Arabs were placed under direct Israeli rule in the newly captured territories. Since the 6-day war, a number of diplomatic initiatives have helped to maintain a very fragile peace in the region, most of the time. In 1978, Israel made peace with Egypt in the Camp David Peace Accords and began a staged withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula that was completed in 1982. Jordan signed a peace treaty with Israel in 1994, and Jordan and Egypt eventually withdrew their claims to sovereignty over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, respectively. The Oslo Accords of 1993 and 1995 resulted in the creation of the Palestinian National Authority, which was tasked with the responsibility of administering limited Palestinian self-governance over parts of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. However, negotiating for peace and actually achieving peace have proven to be entirely different matters. The continued Israeli occupation of territories gained in the 6-day war has obviously continued to be the cause of a long-standing and bitter conflict between Israel, the Palestinians, and the Arab world in general. Many people on both sides of the conflict have opposed and condemned the peace accords signed by their own leaders, each claiming that their own side gave up too much. And so, the hatred and violence that has been the curse of the so-called Holy Land for centuries continues right down to this day, as we are witnessing in the horrific bloodshed and suffering in Gaza today. So what can we take away from this overview of the history of the ancient Promised Land? Well, first, we can see that throughout the centuries, a nation-state named Palestine never existed. Palestine was the name of a geographical territory, but never a nation. Second, a Palestinian state of sorts has actually existed since 1946, when the independent Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan was formed out of the Emirate of Transjordan. Now remember, the Emirate was a part of the original British Mandate for Palestine. And today the population of the Kingdom of Jordan is 70% Palestinian. Third, it is true that the modern state of Israel owes its existence to the political machinations and maneuverings through the United Nations of the victorious powers of World War II. But the same must be said of nearly half the nations of Europe. New nations that were carved out of the defunct empires of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia through the League of Nations by the winners of World War I include Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Austria, Hungary, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia have since been subdivided into a number of other sovereign states as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the disintegration of the Iron Curtain. Now, if these nations have a legal right to exist and defend their borders, then so does Israel. However, I believe that the existence of the modern state of Israel is based only on these historical and political factors, totally unrelated to any covenantal commitments made by God to the ancient Israelite people. It seems that in recent history, the Jewish people have been at one and the same time the most reviled and the most revered of all people on earth. On the one hand, pernicious and malevolent anti-Semitism has led to more than one attempt to annihilate them completely. On the other, dispensational theology has exalted the Jewish people to the point that the support and defense of the modern state of Israel has become a cardinal doctrine in most forms of evangelical Christianity. I have no idea how the current war in Israel is going to end. Israel may come out on top again, as she has in every other Arab-Israeli conflict since 1948. But even if she does not, even if Israel is taken down and ceases to exist as a nation, it is not going to cause a crisis of faith for me. In part one of this study, I presented the reasons why I believe that the promise of the land of Canaan to the biblical Israelites expired with the end of the Mosaic covenant. And I want to conclude this study by revisiting those conclusions. 1. God has fulfilled every promise made to the descendants of Abraham through Isaac and Jacob, and acted on every warning contained in the Mosaic covenant through the gospel of Christ and the divinely guided unfolding of human history. 2. Politically, the future state of Israel is just as subject to the same ebb and flow of history as any other nation. There is no partiality among nations with God. And 3, spiritually, the Jewish people of the Christian era will stand or fall in the final judgment on the same basis as everyone else. That is, whether or not they have responded in faith to Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior.